This July, as the month unfolds, the Church celebrates Saint Benedict of Nursia, father of Western monks and patron saint of Europe. His feast day is the 11th. But how is it, 15 centuries later, that this simple man continues to inspire millions? His message of balance between prayer and work, his spiritual wisdom, and his monastic rule offer us, amidst our own crises, a proven path to a full life. As we delve into this Benedictine month, let's open our hearts to the teachings of a man who, from Subiaco to Monte Cassino, transformed not only religious life, but Western civilization itself. Chapter 1. The young man who left everything behind. The year was 480, in the small town of Nursia, in the Italian region of Umbria. Benedict was born, the son of a wealthy and noble family. His arrival coincided with a time of profound crisis for the Western Roman Empire. Just 4 years earlier, the Western Roman Empire had officially fallen, and the Italian peninsula was under the dominion of barbarian tribes. This context of cultural decline, political instability, and moral confusion deeply impacted the young Benedict's sensitivity and vocation, predisposing him to seek an alternative path to the one offered by that decaying society. Tradition tells us Benedict had a twin sister, Scholastica, with whom he maintained a close spiritual relationship throughout his life. Both received an education befitting their social standing, based on classical literature, philosophy, and rhetoric. However, from a very young age, the future saint showed a special inclination toward piety and reflection, foreshadowing the extraordinary mission he was called to fulfill. His biographer, Pope St. Gregory the Great, highlights the spiritual maturity he displayed as a child, as if his aged soul resided in a youthful body. Following the custom of noble families, Benedict was sent to Rome to complete his education at the age of 12. The Eternal City, though no longer the imperial capital, remained a significant educational and cultural center. However, what the adolescent found there left him profoundly disappointed. A decaying city where the former grandeur of Rome crumbled not only materially, but also morally. The corruption, debauchery, and frivolity prevalent in student circles starkly contrasted with the Christian values ingrained in the young man's heart. This experience proved decisive for his vocation. Horrified by the depravity he witnessed and fearing succumbing to worldly temptations, Benedict made a radical decision to abandon his studies, renounce his inheritance, and retreat to a solitary place to dedicate himself entirely to the search for God. This decision, made when he was barely 20, would mark not only his personal destiny, but the spiritual and cultural future of Europe, accompanied only by his nurse, who remained loyal and refused to leave him. Benedict left Rome and headed towards the mountainous region of Subiaco, about 30 miles east of the city, seeking a secluded place where he could devote himself to prayer and penance. Following the example of the desert fathers who, in previous centuries, had populated the deserts of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, seeking union with God through solitude and asceticism. Chapter 2. The Subiaco Experience. Reaching the mountainous region of Subiaco, Benedict found the ideal place for his spiritual retreat, an inaccessible cave, nestled in the side of a cliff overlooking the lake formed by the Aniene River. This grotto, later known as the Holy Cave, would become the setting for the first years of his monastic life, and today, transformed into an impressive sanctuary carved into the rock, it continues to attract thousands of pilgrims seeking to drink from the same spiritual wellspring that nourished the young hermit. In this austere refuge, Completely removed from the world, Benedict dedicated himself to a life of intense prayer, rigorous penance, and continuous meditation on the Holy Scriptures, forging in solitude the foundations of his extraordinary spiritual maturity. During this period, the saint faced severe temptations and inner trials. St. Gregory the Great recounts a particularly significant episode in his biography. Tormented by a strong carnal temptation that threatened his vocation, Benedict threw himself naked onto a thicket of thorns, severely wounding his body to overcome, through physical pain, the impulse of lust. This heroic act, which tradition places in the garden that is now part of the monastery of St. Scholastica, became a symbol of his unwavering determination to follow the path of holiness at any cost. Legend says that in the place where Benedict's blood fell, thornless roses subsequently sprouted and continue to bloom to this day. As a testament to the triumph of grace over fallen nature, the reputation of the young hermit's holiness quickly spread throughout the region. One day, a monk named Romanus, who lived in a nearby monastery, accidentally discovered his hiding place. Impressed by the solitary's fervor, Romanus decided to help him, regularly providing bread and water, which he sent to the cave using a rope and a bell to alert Benedict of his arrival. This providential support allowed the saint to prolong his eremitic life for approximately 3 years, a period during which, according to his biographer, dwelling with himself under the gaze of God, he achieved a profound understanding of the Scriptures and the ways of the Spirit. Benedict's isolation came to an end when a group of shepherds accidentally discovered him. Initially, they mistook him for a wild animal due to the animal skins he wore, but upon recognizing him as a man of God, they began to visit him regularly, bringing him food and receiving spiritual instruction in return. Word spread quickly, and soon numerous people from all walks of life flocked to the saint's cave seeking advice, comfort, and guidance. Among them were also monks from neighboring communities who were impressed by the wisdom and discernment of this young hermit without formal monastic training. Thus, he who had sought solitude to find himself and God, paradoxically became a center of attraction and guide for many other spiritual seekers, foreshadowing the mission that awaited him as father and teacher of a multitude of disciples. Chapter 3. First Steps as Abbot. St. Benedict's growing reputation for holiness and spiritual wisdom led the monks of a nearby monastery in Vicovaro, after the death of their abbot, to seek him out to lead their community. He was hesitant at first, knowing the spiritual laxity that prevailed among those religious. But he ultimately agreed, driven by a desire to help them rediscover the authenticity of their monastic vocation. This first experience as abbot would prove decisive in his spiritual evolution and in the development of his future monastic rule, though not exactly because of its immediate success. The monks of Vicovaro, accustomed to relaxed discipline and certain privileges incompatible with the true monastic spirit, quickly felt uncomfortable under the demanding leadership of the new abbot. Benedict's serious understanding of consecrated life, his insistence on prayer and work, his rejection of all frivolity and worldliness clashed head-on with the expectations of those lukewarm religious. Tension mounted until, as St. Gregory recounts, the monks even attempted to poison their abbot, mixing a deadly poison in the wine he was to drink during the meal. However, when Benedict blessed the cup as was his custom, it miraculously shattered, revealing the plot and saving his life. This painful episode, far from discouraging him, provided Benedict with a valuable lesson. He understood that personal fervor alone was not enough to ensure an authentic monastic life. A clear normative framework was needed, a wise and balanced rule that could effectively guide the monks on their path to God. He also learned that the abbot's authority should be exercised with prudence and discernment, adapting to the abilities and needs of each person. As he would later express in his rule, let the abbot know that he must serve more than preside, and he must adapt to the characters of many. With this experience behind him, Benedict returned to his beloved solitude in Subiaco, but not to live as a solitary hermit, but to begin a new form of communal monastic life. Soon, young men eager to embrace monastic life under Benedict's guidance began arriving in Subiaco. Wealthy Roman families entrusted him with the education of their children, among them Maurus and Placidus, who would become his favorite disciples and continue his work. To accommodate this growing spiritual family, the saint founded 12 small monasteries in the surrounding area of his cave, each with 12 monks and a superior subordinate to his authority. This structure, likely inspired by the lauras of Palestinian monasticism, groups of hermitages clustered around a common center, allowed for a combination of the advantages of solitary life with those of community life, and constituted an ideal laboratory for perfecting the monastic model Benedict had in mind. This Subiaco period, which lasted approximately from the year 510 to 529, was extremely fruitful for the spiritual and charismatic maturation of St. Benedict. Difficulties were not lacking. Besides the failure in Vicovaro, he had to face the envy and slander of a local priest named Florentius, who, motivated by jealousy at the saint's growing prestige, attempted to discredit him and even attack his life and that of his disciples. Benedict, following the gospel example, once again decided to withdraw to prevent the conflict from harming his monks. This decision would mark the beginning of a new and definitive stage in his life, the move to Monte Cassino, where he would found his main monastery and write the rule that would immortalize him. Chapter 4. The founding of Monte Cassino. Accompanied by some of his closest disciples, Benedict left Subiaco and traveled south, arriving at a high hill overlooking the city of Cassino, halfway between Rome and Naples. This hill, known as Monte Cassino, was crowned by an ancient temple dedicated to Apollo, surrounded by a sacred grove where pagan cults were still practiced. The fact that, despite Christianity having been the official religion of the empire for over a century, these remnants of paganism persisted, especially in rural areas, reflects the difficulties of evangelization at that turbulent time and the need for a new missionary strategy, which Benedict and his monks would precisely contribute to developing. Moved by apostolic zeal, the saint first dedicated himself to evangelizing the inhabitants of the region, many of whom converted to Christianity impressed by his preaching and example. Then he proceeded to destroy the pagan idols and transform the Temple of Apollo into an oratory dedicated to St. Martin of Tours, a great evangelizer of Gaul. Next to it, he built another dedicated to St. John the Baptist. This choice of patrons was not accidental. Martin represented the ideal of the monk bishop who combines contemplative life and pastoral action, while the Baptist embodied the austere life and prophetic preaching, aspects that Benedict wanted to integrate into his monastic project. Around these two centers of prayer began to rise the monastery that would become the mother house of the Benedictine order, and one of the most important spiritual and cultural centers of medieval Christianity, the founding of Monte Cassino, which occurred around the year 529, marks the beginning of the mature stage in the life of Saint Benedict. Here, with the experience accumulated in Subiaco and an increasingly clear vision of his providential mission, the saint gave final form to his rule and consolidated a model of monastic life perfectly adapted to the spiritual and cultural needs of his time. Unlike the Subiaco foundations, conceived as small scattered communities, Monte Cassino was structured as a single and large monastery, self-sufficient and organically integrated. The complex included, in addition to the church and communal spaces, refectory, chapter house, dormitories, workshops for various trades, gardens, mills, infirmaries, and hospices for pilgrims and the poor. This integral conception of the monastery as a microcosm where all dimensions of human life, spiritual, intellectual, material, found their appropriate place and their transcendent meaning, constitutes one of the most original and fruitful contributions of Saint Benedict to the monastic tradition and, by extension, to all of Western civilization. The Benedictine monastery was not simply a place of prayer isolated from the world, but a true city of God, where the order, peace, and harmony of the heavenly kingdom were anticipated and made visible. This integrated vision explains why Benedictine monasteries, during the Dark Ages following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, became refuges of civilization, where not only the Christian faith was preserved, but also classical culture, the arts, sciences, and techniques that otherwise would have been irretrievably lost. For roughly 20 years, from the founding of Monte Cassino until his death, circa 547, Saint Benedict governed his community with wisdom and discernment, training numerous disciples who would later spread his monastic model throughout Europe. His reputation for holiness and the prestige of his foundation attracted people from all walks of life, from humble peasants to Roman nobles, who flocked to him seeking counsel, comfort, or healing. Even the Ostrogothic king Totila, who then ruled Italy, wished to meet the holy abbot personally. Impressed by accounts of his prophetic gifts and miracles, this encounter, recounted by St. Gregory, shows how Benedict's spiritual authority transcended the monastery walls, exerting a pacifying and humanizing influence on the turbulent society of his time. Chapter 5. The Rule, a Path of Wisdom. The Rule of Saint Benedict, likely composed during the years at Monte Cassino and the fruit of long personal and communal experience, undoubtedly constitutes the saint's masterpiece and his most enduring legacy to the Church and civilization. Originally written in Latin, in a simple yet elegant style, this work consists of a prologue and 73 chapters covering all aspects of monastic life, from the highest spiritual principles to the most practical details of daily organization. Its extraordinary balance between idealism and realism, between demand and understanding, between tradition and innovation, explains its enduring relevance and its decisive influence on the history of Western monasticism. The originality of the Benedictine rule lies not so much in its specific contents, many of which are taken from earlier sources such as the Rule of the Master, the writings of Cassian, or the lives of the Desert Fathers, but in the wisdom with which these elements are integrated into a harmonious and practical synthesis. Saint Benedict, with remarkable discernment, adapted the austere Eastern monastic tradition to the mentality and circumstances of the West, creating a model of religious life accessible to ordinary men, not just exceptional or heroic personalities. As he himself states in the prologue, his intention was to establish a school of divine service where we would impose nothing harsh or burdensome, recognizing the diversity of human abilities and needs. The central theme of the entire rule is the pursuit of God as the primary goal of monastic life. To truly seek God, for Saint Benedict, is the touchstone that allows one to discern the authenticity of a monastic vocation. This radical theocentrism is expressed in the centrality given to the work of God, Opus Dei, the name Saint Benedict uses to designate the monastic liturgy, structured around the canonical hours and the Eucharistic celebration. The Benedictine monk organizes his entire day around these moments of communal prayer, which constitute the beating heart of his existence. Along with this, Lectio Divina, meditative and prayerful reading of the Holy Scriptures, completes the contemplative dimension of this spirituality, providing the inner nourishment necessary for a genuine life in God. Another fundamental aspect of the rule is its conception of the monastic community as a spiritual family presided over by the abbot, who exercises his authority as a representative of Christ, with firmness, but also with mercy and discernment. The abbot, writes Saint Benedict, must know that his mission is more to serve than to preside, and must adapt to the diversity of characters, being severe with the undisciplined, but gentle with the faint-hearted. This paternal vision of authority, which wisely balances respect for the person with the demands of the common good, is one of Saint Benedict's most valuable contributions to the Christian spiritual tradition and to leadership theory in general. The bond that unites the members of the community is not merely juridical or functional, but has the depth and warmth of family relationships, as expressed in the terms used. The abbot is father. The monks are brothers. The monastery is a house where all live under the same rule and obedience. The dignity given to manual labor represents another significant innovation of the Benedictine rule. Unlike the Roman aristocratic mentality, which despised physical labor as the work of slaves, or certain Eastern monastic currents that considered it mere penance, Saint Benedict gives it a positive value, seeing in it not only a means of subsistence, but also a path to sanctification. They are truly monks, he affirms, if they live by the work of their hands, like our fathers and the apostles. This theological valuation of work, expressed in the famous motto, ora et labora, although this specific formulation is later, would have profound repercussions on the economic and social evolution of Europe, decisively contributing to the overcoming of slavery and the dignification of productive activities. The balance between prayer, reading, and work, carefully proportioned according to the seasons of the year and the needs of the community, reflects the profound understanding of human nature that characterizes Benedictine wisdom. Chapter 6. The Benedictine Day. The monastic day, as described by Saint Benedict in his rule, represents a model of balanced life where times dedicated to prayer, work, and rest are harmoniously interwoven. This vital rhythm, calculated with precision according to the seasons of the year and the needs of the community, reflects a profound understanding of human nature and its natural rhythms, avoiding both unrestrained activism and disembodied spirituality. The distribution of time in the Benedictine monastery does not respond to merely utilitarian or productivist criteria, but to a theological vision of time as a divine gift that must be sanctified through its dedication to various activities that nourish the different dimensions of the person. The monastic day begins before dawn with the Office of Vigils, currently called the Office of Readings, a prolonged time of nocturnal prayer that includes the recitation of psalms, biblical and patristic readings, and moments of contemplative silence. This night prayer, in the darkest hours, symbolizes the monk's spiritual vigilance, always attentive to the coming of the Lord. It allows him to begin the day from a deep experience of God. With the first light of dawn, Lauds is celebrated, a hymn of praise to the Creator, inspired by Christ's resurrection, dispelling the darkness and ushering in a new day. Throughout the day, the community will gather several more times for the celebration of the minor hours, prima, terce, sext, and none, brief but intense moments of prayer, sanctifying the main divisions of the day and helping to maintain God's presence amidst daily activities. After the morning offices and a light breakfast, the monks dedicate several hours to manual labor. This might include agricultural work, cultivating gardens, caring for animals, crafts, carpentry, blacksmithing, pottery, construction, maintaining and expanding the monastic facilities, or other tasks. Depending on the community's needs and each monk's abilities, Saint Benedict insists that these activities be performed with a spirit of service and in God's presence, not as a burden, but as participation in the divine creative work. If the brothers must engage in harvest work, he writes, let them not be disheartened, for they are truly monks when they live by the work of their hands. This dignification of manual labor, revolutionary in the cultural context of the time, would be one of the most significant contributions of Benedictine monasticism to Western civilization. Mid-morning, interrupting their work, the monks gather for the celebration of the Eucharist, the center and culmination of all Christian and monastic life. The conventual Mass, celebrated with particular solemnity and beauty, constitutes the privileged moment of encounter with Christ, who gives himself as spiritual nourishment to the community. After the Eucharist, the main meal of the day takes place, shared in the refectory while one of the monks reads from a lectern. This moment is not considered a mere physiological pause, but a communal act with deep spiritual meaning. The shared meal, in silence, with minds uplifted by the edifying reading, symbolizes fraternal communion and the recognition that all nourishment, material and spiritual, comes from divine goodness. Saint Benedict, showing his characteristic balance, allows for sufficient food, adapted to everyone's needs, avoiding both excess and unnecessary deprivation. The afternoon is dedicated to Lectio Divina, prayerful and meditative reading of the Holy Scriptures and other spiritual texts, done individually, but in an atmosphere of communal silence. This is not an academic or merely intellectual study, but an intimate dialogue with God through his word, which the monk reads slowly, ponders internally, and translates into prayer. According to an ancient monastic tradition, Lectio Divina comprises 4 moments. Lectio, attentive reading of the text; meditatio, reflection on its meaning; oratio, prayerful response to the word; and contemplatio, loving quietude in God's presence. This practice, central to Benedictine spirituality, has experienced a remarkable revival in recent decades among lay people, who find in it an accessible and profound method to nourish their spiritual life amidst daily occupations. The monastic day concludes with the celebration of Vespers at sunset, and Compline just before retiring to rest, prayers that recap the day lived and entrust it confidently to divine mercy. Chapter 7. Ora et labora, the balance between prayer and work. Summarized in the famous motto, Ora et labora, although this exact formulation is later than Saint Benedict, constitutes perhaps the most characteristic and recognizable aspect of Benedictine spirituality. In the rule, the saint organizes the monastic day by harmoniously alternating times dedicated to the Opus Dei, liturgical prayer, Lectio Divina, meditative reading of Scripture, and manual or intellectual work. This distribution of time, calculated precisely according to the seasons and the community's needs, reflects a profound understanding of human nature and its natural rhythms, avoiding both unrestrained activism and disembodied spirituality. Prayer occupies a primordial place in Benedictine life. The monks gather several times a day for the communal celebration of the Liturgy of the Hours, structured around psalms, hymns, biblical readings, and prayers. Saint Benedict dedicates numerous chapters of his rule to meticulously detailing how this work of God should be carried out, emphasizing the importance of performing it with inner attention and outward reverence. Let us consider, he writes, how we ought to behave in the presence of God and his angels, and let us attend the divine office in such a way that our minds agree with our voices. This monastic liturgy, celebrated with dignity and beauty, constitutes the heart of community life and the framework in which the spiritual unity of the brothers is forged. Work, far from being considered a secondary or merely utilitarian activity, takes on a spiritual dimension in the Benedictine vision. Saint Benedict conceives it as participation in God's creative work and as a means of service to the brothers and to society. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, he categorically affirms, prescribing that the monks dedicate themselves to manual labor for several hours a day. These activities encompassed a wide spectrum, from agriculture and livestock farming to crafts, manuscript copying, or teaching. The saint demands that the monks treat the monastery's tools and goods as sacred vessels of the altar, thus emphasizing the dignity of work done with a spirit of service, and the sacredness of the everyday when lived in God's presence. The Benedictine perspective on work also implies a specific vision of time and material goods, facing the consumerist mentality that characterizes our contemporary societies, obsessed with accumulation and waste. The rule proposes a sober and responsible relationship with available resources. The monks work not to enrich themselves individually, but to ensure the self-sufficiency of the community and to be able to share with those in need. Time is conceived not as a commodity to be exploited to exhaustion, but as a divine gift that must be sanctified through its alternate dedication to various activities that nourish the different dimensions of the person. This wisdom in the management of time and resources offers a profoundly relevant alternative model to the imbalances in our economic system. It's a timeless lesson. Chapter 8. The Monastic Vows. Benedictine monastic life is structured around three fundamental vows, or commitments, solemnly pronounced by the novice upon definitive admission into the community: stability, conversion of customs, and obedience. These three pillars, which St. Benedict considered essential for the authentic following of Christ in monastic life, constitute an evangelical response to three deeply ingrained tendencies in fallen human nature: the inconstancy that leads us to abandon commitments when difficulties arise, the resistance to inner change that keeps us clinging to our vices and whims, and the pride that rebels against all legitimate authority. Through these vows, the monk consciously relinquishes the autonomy to determine his destiny, embracing a life project that stably binds him to a specific community, under the guidance of a spiritual father, on a path of continuous conversion. The vow of stability, stabilitas loci, represents one of St. Benedict's most original contributions to monastic tradition. Unlike Eastern monasticism, where changes of community and itinerancy were frequent, the Saint of Nursia understood that true spiritual growth requires perseverance in a specific place and with a concrete community. To remain in the monastery until death is not simply a disciplinary rule, but a profound spiritual choice. The monk renounces the constant search for new experiences or supposedly more favorable environments, accepting the limitations and challenges of his community as the concrete ground where his vocation must flourish. This stability does not imply immobility or stagnation, but the maturity of someone who understands that true inner transformation does not depend on changing external circumstances, but on persevering fidelity in the everyday. The conversion of customs, conversatio morum, implies a commitment to a continuous process of inner transformation, a gradual abandonment of worldly habits and the acquisition of evangelical virtues. It is not simply a matter of externally fulfilling certain norms or practicing specific ascetic observances, but of a true metanoia, a radical change of mind and heart. Saint Benedict was realistic. He knew that this conversion is not accomplished once and for all, but is a long and demanding journey, with advances and setbacks, requiring humility to recognize one's weaknesses and docility to allow oneself to be guided. That is why the rule provides various aids for this process: the spiritual direction of the abbot, fraternal correction, specific times for examination of conscience, regular confession of faults, all practices aimed at facilitating that progressive inner transformation in the image of Christ. The vow of obedience is considered by Saint Benedict as fundamental in monastic life, to the point that the first chapter of the rule is precisely dedicated to defining monks as those who serve under a rule and an abbot. Benedictine obedience should not be understood as mere passive submission or an alienating renunciation of one's personality, but as an evangelical attitude of attentive listening. The Latin term obedientia derives from ob audire, to listen attentively, to the voice of God that manifests itself through various mediators, the Holy Scriptures, the rule, the abbot, the brothers. In making a vow of obedience, the monk does not abdicate his personal responsibility or his capacity for discernment, but places them within a broader framework of ecclesial communion and openness to the divine plan. The first degree of humility, writes Saint Benedict, is obedience without delay, an attitude that requires not only external discipline but, above all, inner freedom and trust that through the sometimes mysterious paths of obedience, God is shaping the monk in the image of Christ, obedient unto death, even death on a cross. To these three traditional vows, some add a fourth, which, although not explicitly formulated as such in the rule, is clearly present in all its spirit: hospitality. Chapter 53 prescribes that all guests who present themselves be received as Christ. For he himself said, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me." This welcome is not limited to providing food and lodging, but implies an attitude of deep respect and service towards the visitor, in whom the mysterious presence of the Lord is recognized. It is significant that Saint Benedict orders that upon receiving guests, both the abbot and the entire community bow or even prostrate themselves in adoration, thus recognizing Christ in them. This Benedictine hospitality, practiced for centuries, has transformed monasteries into privileged places of encounter between people of diverse origins and conditions, decisively contributing to overcoming social, cultural, and religious barriers. In our contemporary world, marked by massive migrations, intercultural conflicts, and growing individualism, this tradition of unconditional welcome represents a prophetic witness to universal fraternity. Chapter 9. The Miracles of the Saint. The life of Saint Benedict, according to the account of his principal biographer, Saint Gregory the Great, was marked by numerous prodigious events that manifested his intimate union with God and the supernatural power that accompanies authentic sanctity. These miracles, narrated in the second book of Gregory's Dialogues, should not be interpreted as mere wondrous anecdotes, but as signs that illuminate fundamental aspects of the saint's spiritual personality and his providential mission in the Church. Through them, God accredited Benedict's authority and confirmed the validity of his monastic proposal in a time of profound religious and cultural crisis. One of the best-known miracles is that of the broken sieve or riddle. During his stay in Enfide, present-day Affale, before retiring to Subiaco, Benedict miraculously repaired a clay sieve that his nurse had borrowed and had accidentally broken. The utensil, restored by the saint's prayer, was hung over the door of the local church as a testimony to the prodigy. This simple miracle, the first attributed to him, already reveals an essential characteristic of Benedictine spirituality: attention to the everyday, the conviction that God manifests himself not only in great events, but also in the small details of daily life. This sensitivity to perceive the divine in the seemingly trivial is one of the most appealing aspects of the Benedictine charism, which has harmoniously integrated the supernatural and the human, the extraordinary and the ordinary. The power over natural elements is manifested in several episodes of Saint Benedict's life. On one occasion, while the monks were building an extension to the monastery, a huge stone that they had to move seemed immovable despite all their efforts. The saint, understanding that the devil had sat upon it to hinder the work, offered a prayer and blessed the stone, which immediately could be moved with ease. On another occasion, a monk working felling trees by the lake accidentally dropped the iron head of his tool into the water. Saint Benedict took the handle, inserted it into the water, and the iron head miraculously emerged, rejoining both parts. These prodigies, reminiscent of similar episodes in the lives of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, show the mastery over nature that is recovered by someone who, like Benedict, has achieved inner freedom through obedience to God. It's significant that these miracles occur in contexts of manual labor, thus underlining the dignity that the saint attributed to these activities. In keeping with his integrative vision of monastic life, the gift of prophecy and discernment of spirits was particularly manifested in the famous encounter with the Gothic king Totila, narrated in detail by St. Gregory. In the year 546, when this barbarian monarch, an Arian by religion, victoriously traversed Italy sowing terror, he wanted to test the supernatural powers of the abbot of Monte Cassino, of which he had heard so much. He sent one of his officers, Rigo, dressed in royal insignia, to present himself before Benedict posing as the king. But as soon as the impostor came into the saint's presence, Benedict unmasked him. "Get away, son. Get away with what you are wearing, because it is not yours." When Totila later presented himself personally, Benedict rebuked him for his cruelties and prophesied, "You have done much evil. You are doing much evil. Cease committing injustices. You will enter Rome. You will cross the sea. You will reign for 9 years. And in the 10th you will die." The prophecy was fulfilled exactly, and the impressed Totila considerably moderated his cruelty from this encounter onward. This episode illustrates how the spiritual authority of Saint Benedict transcended the monastery walls to exert a pacifying and humanizing influence on the turbulent society of his time. The saint's thaumaturgical power was also manifested in numerous healings. St. Gregory recounts how he healed a monk crushed by a collapsing wall, restored sight to a blind man, freed numerous possessed individuals, and resurrected the son of a peasant. These miracles, performed with simplicity and without ostentation, reflect Benedict's compassion for human suffering and his participation in Christ's healing power. However, what is most remarkable is that these extraordinary gifts never diverted him from his path of humility and obedience to the divine will. As St. Gregory points out, the man of God shone through his miracles, but no less through the wisdom of his doctrine, a balance that characterizes authentic Christian holiness. In a world obsessed with the spectacular and the immediate, the figure of Saint Benedict reminds us that the true miracles are the inner transformations, the profound conversions, the lasting fruits of holiness that blossom from a life surrendered without reservation to God. Chapter 10. The Passing to Heaven. The passing of St. Benedict to eternal life, which probably occurred around the year 547, was surrounded by extraordinary circumstances that reflect his profound union with God and his spiritual clairvoyance. St. Gregory the Great, our main historical source on these events, relates that the saint predicted the exact date of his death to some of his disciples several days in advance, thus allowing them to prepare spiritually for that moment. This ability to contemplate serenely the end of earthly life, seeing it not as a tragedy but as the fulfillment of human vocation, illustrates the spiritual maturity achieved by the patriarch after decades of faithful following of the monastic path. His example reminds us that death, lived in faith, is not an annihilation but a transition, a passage to the fullness of communion with God that the monk has sought throughout his life. 6 days before his death, Benedict asked that his tomb, prepared next to that of his sister Scholastica in the crypt of the Abbey Church of Monte Cassino, be opened. Immediately afterward, he was struck by a violent fever that confined him to bed, and quickly consumed him. Despite extreme physical weakness, his spirit remained lucid and serene. The saint received with great devotion the viaticum, the sacrament of the Eucharist, as nourishment for the last journey, and continued instructing and comforting his monks until the very last moment, thus demonstrating that the abbot's mission as a spiritual father does not cease even at death's door. This consistency between life and death, this continuity in surrender until the last breath, is one of the most valuable testimonies that Saint Benedict has left us. Fidelity is not a matter of isolated moments of fervor, but of daily perseverance on the chosen path. On the day of his passing, Benedict asked his disciples to take him to the oratory, for he wished to surrender his soul to God in the same place where he had so often prayed and celebrated the divine mysteries. There, supported by the arms of his spiritual sons, standing and with his hands raised to heaven, he breathed his last while praying. According to tradition, his last words were a verse from the psalm, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." This death, lived as an act of adoration and trusting abandonment into the Father's hands, constitutes the final seal of an existence entirely consecrated to the seeking of God, the primary objective of all monastic life according to the Benedictine rule. The praying posture adopted by the saint in his final moment also symbolizes his understanding of death as a liturgical act, as the culmination of that work of God to which he had dedicated his energies primarily throughout his life. On the same day of St. Benedict's death, two monks, one residing in Monte Cassino and another who was far from the monastery, simultaneously had the same vision, a resplendent path, covered with precious tapestries and illuminated by countless torches, extending from the saint's cell to heaven. A majestic voice explained, "This is the path by which Benedict, the beloved of God, ascended to heaven." This miracle, recounted by St. Gregory, symbolically expresses the Church's certainty of the heavenly glorification of the Holy Patriarch, whose life was a constant ascent toward God, drawing countless souls along that same path of holiness. The image of the luminous path also evokes the role of spiritual guide that St. Benedict played during his life, and which, from heavenly glory, he continues to exert for all those who seek God following his monastic rule and his example. The mortal remains of St. Benedict were buried, according to his wish, alongside those of his sister, St. Scholastica, in the crypt of the Abbey Church of Monte Cassino. There they remained until the 8th century, when, faced with the Lombard invasions that threatened to destroy the monastery, the monks transferred the relics to the Abbey of Fleury, present-day Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, in France. This transfer, although controversial from a historical point of view, since the monks of Monte Cassino have always maintained that only a part of the relics were taken to France, gave rise to an intense veneration of the saint in Gaul, contributing to the spread of his cult and his rule throughout Western Europe. Today, St. Benedict's tomb in Fleury remains an important pilgrimage site where countless faithful come to venerate the Father of Europe and implore his intercession. The historical vicissitudes of the saint's body, contested among various places, reflect the profound mark he left on Western Christendom and the desire of numerous communities to maintain a tangible connection with his blessed memory. Chapter 11. A Prayer to Saint Benedict. O glorious Saint Benedict, Father of monks and patron saint of Europe, we come to you in this month of July as we celebrate your feast day. Teach us to discern what is truly important in life, and help us to find, like you, the right balance between prayer and work, solitude and community, firmness and mercy. Intercede for the Church and for the world, so that the values that inspired your life continue to enrich our societies. Teach us to listen with the ear of the heart in a world saturated with noise, protect us from all evil, and at the end of our journey, help us to serenely surrender our souls to God as you did, with our gaze fixed on heaven. Amen.